My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And this episode's content is our most anti-establishment yet, as we look into Carapace.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. Carapace is a 16-page zine created by Goblin's Henchmen and published in 2018. It was free, but is now pay what you want. We are told that Carapace is an adventure into a giant ant colony with 3 different procedural methods to make or navigate the labyrinth-like maze. The procedural methods have been applied to the exploration of a maze-like giant insect colony. That said, these methods could easily be retrofitted to any maze-like setup. For example, a patchwork of islets in the Bonesuck Swamp, glades in an impenetrable wood, goblin caves, an overland trade route, an archipelago of mysterious islands in a pirate romp, or rooms in an abandoned space station.
The contents of the zine begin with the adventure background and some in medias res starting scenes, some PC to NPC entanglements, and a gallery of NPCs and their accompanying plot hooks. After that initial generic fantasy setup, we get to the mechanical meat of the zine, and that is split into 3 lettered sections. A presents the hive or nest as a point crawl, including the template, the method for making it, and some helpful suggestions, and then 3 worked examples. Number 1, a riverbank giant ant colony in a top-down view. 2, a mound ant colony, a sectional view. And 3, a giant wasp nest, which is a cross-section. Section B uses the labyrinth move to navigate the mapless dungeon. More on that later, I suspect. And Section C uses something called the hex flower, which is a thing that we will explore in more depth later on, but is kind of a board gamey, also mapless dungeon and method for navigating it. Then follow some appendices. There is the encounter engine, environmental dressing, which is to say randomly determining the nature of the various nest chambers that one enters. Then there are the monster stat block summaries, and finally a bit of background on the area surrounding the hive. And let us not forget, however, there is a bonus 1-page supplement called the Queen/False Queen Encounter.
So how have we used this in our games, Tom?
I ran a one-shot of this using Breakers, which is also known as World of Dungeons Turbo, so that's the kind of modern-day Ghostbusters, but D&D. And specifically, I used the Hex Flower version of this. And at this point, I would also like to add the disclaimer. This was a review copy that I got, or rather a gift from the author to Fear of a Black Dragon. He posted me the print zine here in Hong Kong, which was nice. And I think you might have missed that message, Jason, because this was in the dying days of Google Plus when all the notifications stopped working.
I definitely did. Yeah, I have no memory of this. So I've actually only read it. So things we liked about Carapace. I think I'll start because I think everything I have to say, I think you're just going to expand on.
Yeah,
so, let me just get my little bit in. You know, it's really interesting because what I normally like in the modules that we cover for this program is the story, the NPCs, the narrative structure, the themes, and the world that the module kind of like is implied to take place in, like the setting material. Those are the kinds of things I like. You know, Scenic Dunsmith, I love all those great NPC connections, those like sick, twisted families and their secrets. And, you know, Yun Suin, there's like all this overhang of like beautiful, colorful set decoration and plot hooks and things. Carapace is not that kind of module, right? Like it's not a story. It is maybe not completely generous to call it this, but it's just a procedure. It's a set of procedures for having an ant colony, a giant ant colony location in your game that's otherwise about something else, right? And so that sounds like I'm saying something bad about it, but in fact, it's what I like about it. It's an interesting change of pace. I think that not enough modules consider mechanical possibilities or mechanical alternatives or procedures for exploring things or different ways of looking at like D&D environments. Like, I don't think many modules do that, and this module does do that. It's an earnest, detailed attempt at showing different ways that you could explore this ant colony, and I find that to be a fascinating approach.
Yeah, I agree. That's what I love about it. It's so common to have like one scenario framework or a mechanic, and then you'll see a book or supplement that shows how to use this thing in different settings or contexts. But Carapace has flipped that around and taken one idea, exploring a giant insect nest, and given you instructions on how you could do it in 3 different mechanical ways, and then given you fully worked examples to help you decide which one is going to be the one that you want to do. And just as an experiment, it's great. I think if you look at RPG blogs and the like, you'll often see people noodling around with these ideas. You could do this like this or that with a couple of bullet points. But here, Goblin's Henchman has actually done the work so that you could choose any of them and just do it in your game right away, which is really great. Maybe one reason I like this is I've sort of attempted something like this myself once. I wrote a supplement for Mutant Chronicles, and the thing there was that there was a sort of embedded adventure in this. It was about exploring the now completely ruined post-apocalyptic Earth and the weird factions that lived there, because your characters normally came from the moon, doesn't matter. But the point is that the embedded adventure was going around and finding these missing ancient skulls that had parts of a code written on them. It was a bit heavy metal. But because the adventure was kind of going to be the same in every location you went to, I decided to try and use different formats each time. So there was one where it was a bit like a dungeon starter from Dungeon World, one that was a bit like, or a lot like, a transmission from Tech Noir. But that isn't quite the same as what is being done here in Carapace, because they were still quite different scenarios, so I wasn't genuinely trying to take the same thing and match it to different mechanical procedures. But I have a kind of inbuilt sympathy for that idea of switching things up by emphasizing different elements through how you approach it systematically.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a similar sympathy at least from this vantage point or standpoint of wanting to find different ways of exploring these fantasy environments, right? I mean, the labyrinth move, which is one of the procedural methods in this module, but the labyrinth move that I created for Dungeon World 100 years ago, its whole thing is like, how do we look at the navigation of spaces differently, right? And so I'm with it in spirit, right? Like, I think it's really cool in that way. Another thing I liked about it is, kind of segueing from my thought about the labyrinth move there, this actually uses the labyrinth move as originally intended. So I should maybe unpack the labyrinth move for people who aren't familiar with it, although it is become something of a widespread thing at this point. But the labyrinth move is something I created for Dungeon World back in 2015 or so, where basically it's a single move that abstracts the navigation of a large labyrinth-like space, right? When I originally wrote it, it was 4 spaces that would be impractical to map, both in the fiction and even at the table, right? Like, in both cases, like, it would be impractical to map a giant colony with a bunch of twisting tunnels, right? It would be impractical to map a massive, abandoned, decayed city. It would be impractical to map a per se labyrinth, right? And so I created the labyrinth move to help, like, to create an abstraction that allows you to quote, navigate that space without having to actually map it out. And a lot of people in the intervening years have used the labyrinth move in a way where they apply it to just a regular dungeon that is mappable. And I don't favor that necessarily. Like, it's not my favorite use of the labyrinth move because it's not what I wrote it to do. But that said, I've seen a lot of really interesting things out there. Trophy Gold does it, although in Trophy Gold, the hunt roll, which is based off the labyrinth move, feels nothing like the labyrinth move in play, so I give it a pass. So I like that this module actually sticks to what the labyrinth move was for. That's a small thing to like about it, but it is personally important to me. And then another thing I like, the hex flower procedure is really interesting. I'm not 100% sure I understand it. I read it. I I read the associated blog, which I'm going to talk about later. I think I need to play it. I'm really intrigued by it, but I think it's one of those things that you have to actually get to the table for it to start to make sense.
Yeah, I think you that was my experience. It really was. I too was intrigued by it, and I printed out that page with the hex flower on it at double the zine size just for practical purposes and took it along. I was really not sure how it was going to go, and indeed we did struggle a bit with it at first. Because when you first start out, the hex flower it's a hexagon of hexagons, and you're trying to get from the bottom to the top by essentially rolling 2d6 and moving in a random direction, which of course, because it's a probability curve, tends to go one way. But as you go through hexes, some of them represent different hazards or treasures or different possibilities for random encounters, and there are also different kinds of points you can get, which I think, if I'm recalling correctly, are recon, intelligence, and a third one I've forgotten, which you can then spend to alter the direction that you move when you move. And so that's the sort of board gaming aspect of it. And you fairly quickly, I would say within half an hour of having had a few turns at it, we'd got the hang of it and we're starting to master how to point ourselves in the right direction to get to our destination, the Queen Ant's chamber on the far side of that hex, hopefully without encountering anything terrible. I think it's important to note that you can't just board game it. It's not just a board game. It is an engine for getting you to different encounters as well. So, like, the things that happen if you roll up randomly encountering some fire-breathing insects, what happens in that scene needs to matter in following rolls as well. Otherwise, I think it's not that engaging. And there's another aspect which I think is super important, which is the hunter, the kind of the hive's security system, in quotes. And that's like another counter on the board that also moves at random and is kind of trying to get you. And you can try and use your knowledge of the hive to avoid it or to make it go a different way. And I think I've seen some hexflower examples, like on the blog and elsewhere, done by other people that don't have it. Like it's just a random encounter generator for sea travel. And I'm not sure that would work as well. A lot of what was tense about our game going into this giant just nest of unmappable stuff was the worry that at any moment we could accidentally turn around a corner and run into the hunter. And that was a big deal. I don't think it would work as well without that. So if you're going to use it, I think you have to invent some circumstance that represents something that could be chasing after your heroes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that last bit does. I think overall that was a heroic effort to explain the hex flower procedure, Tom. Yeah, you just have to look at it and try to play it because it's so interesting, but I would say it's difficult to verbalize like what's interesting about it or what it's even doing, right? But I'm about 75% with you on that. Okay, so other things. The Queen supplement is really good. I think it was one of your notes too.
Yeah.
It's gruesome. It's fun. It's got some cool, interesting tensions in it. I really, really liked it.
Yeah. It's a sudden encounter of horror fantasy. I'll be honest with you. I kind of wish that the NPCs and background bit around the hive that is presented in the main zine, I wish it had been more like that Queen encounter. I think it's a bit
yes,
cooler.
I agree.
Because the setting that you're given is kind of that friendly, quite non-threatening bucolic fantasy, which is not really my jam, I have to say. So as well put together as it was, like there's plenty of stuff going on, but I want more creepy queen ants with dripping manacles.
Yeah, the queen thing like makes it more metal, which I think is just more appealing. So yeah. Okay, anything else you want to say about what you liked?
Oh yeah, I really want to talk about the appendices as well. And quite impressively, they apply equally well to all three of the mechanical approaches, which is good work. The most significant part, I think, here is that you've got two sets of random. There's appendices 1 and 2 are basically random encounters that might show up, i.e., terrifying giant insects, pretty much. And then the dungeon dressing. So, what's this chamber like? Does it slope upwards? Is it freezing cold? Does it smell weird? And the instruction is a little throwaway line that says the players should roll up and describe the chamber while the GM is sorting out the encounter tables. It's sort of got instructions for how many dice you should roll to determine what ants and insects you're going to run into. I think there's a lot of mechanical, mathematical work going on below the surface. It's like a swan. On the surface, it looks all serene and stately, but it's paddling like crazy beneath the water. And that was what really stuck out, was this story-gamey collaboration between the whole group to make a narrative out of these random rolls. So like, with very minimal input from me, the players, which included a teenager whose previous exposure to role-playing was just watching Critical Role, and her very amiable dad who was there for moral support, everyone really mucked in very quickly, describing what the chambers were like, and starting to make connections between where they were now and where they'd been, and giving a narrative shape to the hive, which was great. We've discussed before, I think it was the Fever Swamp episode, this idea of pattern matching, where you start to read significance into things that are actually random. Like, we keep meeting skeletons where there are blue flowers, so maybe the flowers and the skeletons are connected, but they're not. In this case, everyone knew it was random. They're still making those connections. So there was a recurring thing where wind would be blowing through a chamber, and we started to have this narrative that you could follow the air currents to get to places. And at one point, they would still, even though they knew it was random, they would make it into part of the story they could use. Like someone literally said at one point, "Oh, we've rolled up dead air in this chamber. That must mean one of the tunnel that leads to the Queen is blocked, so we need to demolish part of the wall here and then go climbing." And that's what they did. That's how the story developed. So even though it looks very mechanical, I guess is the way to say it, it does generate really interesting stories, which was surprising and good.
Fantastic. No, that's great. Questions we had. Okay, well, so the question that I just thought of, is that something that your group just did, or is it supported in the actual procedure, in your opinion, or is it something in the middle?
Oh, I think it's somewhere in the middle, I would say. I think you could, if you were very unimaginative, you could, as a group, sit around just rolling, okay, this room's hot, what do we do now? Anything to fight? No, so yeah, that would happen. But there's something about, I think it's very hard as a human being to have a sequence of events and not, like, make something out of them. Like, even if like all the rooms were totally different, like you happen to roll one of each result as you were making your way through the hive chambers, that too would become part of the story. Like, what's up with this hive? Why is everything completely different from one portion to the other? And characters would start to theorize about it. So you're sort of nudged in that direction, I think.
Okay, fair. Yeah. That's fair. Yeah. What's your question?
Well, I want to talk about the town and the NPCs. I've said I quite like it, but it's my least favourite bit. I feel like the village near the hive was included so that Carapace would be something that feels complete, like that you could have just this and run an adventure. But, I mean, is that necessary? Would it really matter if that wasn't there, do you think?
I think a comparison is good here. I would compare it to, what's the other one that we reviewed that has ants? Like time-traveling ants or something?
What?
There is one.
Hang on.
Yeah, there's one where there's like a time travel gate, or maybe they're cockroaches. I don't remember.
Oh yeah. Sorry, that's the Wizardarium of Calabraxis, right? With the time travel.
No. Soccer Blue.
Oh no. The trouble with OSR is there are too many insects and cockroach civilizations in them.
Yeah, I know. I'm pretty sure it's Soccer Blue.
Oh, yeah,
in any case, that village was significantly more interesting than the one here. And that village, what made it more interesting is that it created possibilities. Like, you could imagine, doing the principal adventure, which is, flushing out the goblins, possibly ants, possibly cockroaches, because I can't quite remember. I know there was time travel. Yeah. You could do that, or you could maybe find hooks into other things, right? Like the village had this feeling of like a sandbox, even if it really wasn't, right? I don't feel like that's what's going on here. In this one, it's all the hooks are just about going to the ant colony, right? Yeah, and I think so it makes it feel a little flat, right? And so, but I think it begs the question of whether it was necessary. It's pretty clear that Goblin's henchmen just wanted to do the procedural stuff, right? Like, it's pretty obvious that's kind of what they wanted to do. And like you said, it feels a little tacked on. I can't knock it because, honestly, you get the impression that the Carapace is kind of a work in progress. And indeed, he released a supplement about the Queen later on, or they released a supplement. I actually don't know their gender, but yeah, to answer your question, I don't think it's necessary, but I could see a world where it is fleshed out more, and I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right, let's go to the chain lightning round. There's an entry for a giant stag beetle, which is battering the town gate, and we are told that the town guard will eventually see it off with pikes and buckets of peppered horse urine.
In the Queen encounter, this quote, periodically, she dribbles juice from her delicate mandibles into the human's begging mouth.
There is a townsmith called Beulah, who is a retired town guard who, quote, took a mandible to the knee. I'm not normally sympathetic to this classic Skyrim joke, but I don't know, I was feeling charitable when I read this.
The point crawl section has a subsection called Suggestions on setting up paths and so on, and I think this is great, a bit of breaking the fourth wall and just saying directly to the reader, here's what I find tends to work best.
And finally, there's a bit of symmetry with a two-headed giant character in the setup. There's this two-headed giant, I believe it's a two-headed giant, maybe a hill giant, it's some kind of giant. In any case, if you can encounter them in the village and you learn that they're sort of like almost like a pet of the village, like the village they don't have any bad feelings toward it, like it's no danger, it's just this creature that hangs around, right? But if you don't encounter them then, you can encounter them later in the environment on the adventure, and maybe you kill them. and that would be really tragic, right? So I kind of like that. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. Tom, what are we talking about today?
All right, I would like to talk about a thing that is related to the specific game that we played of Carapace, which is our player characters were all employees of Perhilitan, the Peninsular Malaysian Department of Wildlife and National Parks. So they were the kind of the weird stuff squad of that organisation employed to go and investigate particularly peculiar wildlife problems. I mean, supposedly the inhabitants of the monument termite mound in the middle of Kuala Lumpur were probably a protected species, but they still ended up shooting quite a few giant insects. However, yeah, we found that this was we had a good time with Carapace with the mechanical bits and bobs, but also what I found was working very well was this tension between, we're supposed to be kind of going along and just videoing stuff, taking readings, making notes about the wildlife and what's taken up residence in the hive and so on. But, we're also kind of gun-happy player characters. And those two strands worked really well. So I was thinking non-lethal campaign frames, basically. What are ways that we can have kind of goals in place specifically for adventure games, by the way, because, you can set up Monster Hearts or something and that's not really an issue. But games where you expect to go and have, high adventure, stunts, fighting, but without the actual thing you're on a mission to do being those activities. And are there pros and cons to this? What are your initial thoughts?
Well, my initial thought is that the tension here is obvious, right? And you've alluded to it somewhat. And that is that game selection really matters here. I think, I think it depends on what we're talking about here. If we're talking about how to make D&D or D&D-like games to be in non-lethal campaign frameworks, that's one conversation. And then I think there's a conversation about maybe not using D&D to do your non-lethal campaign frameworks, right? And the D&D one is interesting because, I've always thought that you can tell, in most games, you can tell what the game intends for you to be doing based off how much word count is dedicated to what particular kind of action, right? Yep. And if you flip through D&D, you would be led to believe that it's about combat and magic. And with combat being such a heavy emphasis in D&D, I do think there's a tension there, a tension between your characters who are, say, maybe exploring the land in order to map something or, trying to bring back botanical samples for the wizardarium or whatever, and this impetus to kill things, because that's what D&D is kind of set up to do, right? All of its rules are about killing things, most of its rules, right? And so I think that's an interesting tension, And I think that people are going to have different philosophies about how to approach this tension and what to do about it. My personal philosophy is that you should find the game that does better what you want to do, but there may not be a game out there about a group of scientists, searching for a termite colony, right? Like, there may not be a good game for that. And so you do have to kind of think about, how do we adjust the mechanics of the game that we do have to make this work?
Yeah, I think it is very important that you still are fulfilling the promise of the game you're playing, right? That core activity is going to feature. I mean, that's why one of the cons, I think, of a non-lethal campaign frame is that it doesn't always sound that exciting, and so therefore the pitch might be tricky. I came here to swing a sword and throw fireballs at people, not to collect butterflies in the mountains. That being said, I think one of the pros of this is that it is often more like the adventure stories, both fictional and non-fictional, that games like D&D are supposedly based on. So, they are not just about fighting. So, I mean, for example, if you think of King Solomon's Mines, the Alan Quatermain starring classic by H. Rod Hager, it's that they start off going to search for a missing person, and the adventure is a thing that happens to the characters by accident, kind of. Now, as it happens, they're all weapon-wielding badasses who are very well able to cope with that kind of stuff. But at least ostensibly, what they're doing at first is a practical, specific goal that is, achievable and leads you to what I think is interesting tension. How far do we indulge in the adventuring part compared to the doing what we're here to do? A classic one in old school gaming is Traveller, where if you've got a free trader spaceship, in theory what you're supposed to be doing is picking up cargoes, buy cheap, sell expensive. That's not the phrase, is it? Whatever. On different planets. But of course, adventures keep happening to you. And I remember seeing an anecdote in Arcane magazine back in the day of a guy whose brother had been roped in to play Traveller on the promise that it was, like Elite, that computer game you like. So this kid was constantly just going, guys, why are you investigating murders and having fights with people? We're supposed to get this cargo to this other planet before the end of the month. And that, I think, is something that's just gives you interesting tension within the group, and gives you interesting decisions to make about how far you're going to pursue one goal or another. Also, I think sometimes it's nice to have a noble, non-violent goal rather than just let's kick down some doors and steal treasure.
Well, but I also think that there's this danger, as you presented it somewhat, there's this, you might be able to say that every fantasy campaign starts as a non-lethal campaign framework, right? Most people I imagine most of even if you get down to the real elemental, just treasure hunter type parties, right? They don't want to fight monsters, right? They want to find treasure, right? And so I think I feel like there's a spectrum here, right?
Yeah.
And what I think is the more interesting question is not so much not necessarily what do the player characters want to be doing, but what do we want to be doing as players, right? I think that's the difference. I'm with you. I follow all that. I wonder how many quote unquote non-lethal campaign frameworks just devolve into being fights half the time, though, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I suppose if you want a kind of touchstone for what the advantage of a non-lethal campaign is, that interesting decisions are always what make a game good. And a lot of the time in a fighty game, there's no decision about whether or not to retreat. One of the great things about Trophy Gold is that there is a real tension in deciding whether you're going to stick around and keep fighting a monster. Because if you do keep fighting, you might die. But if you run away, you make it much more likely that one of your friends is going to die due to the way the mechanics work. I think if you have dual tracks of two slightly different activity goals going on, it means you're able to face the possibility of failure in a more fun way. It's quite boring to do a mainstream D&D, we do this fight, then we do this fight thing, because you're never really going to lose. Everything's been calibrated so it's going to be fine. Whereas, if you have an A and B plot, so to speak, you can succeed on one track while having the equivalent of a total party kill on the other. Or an actual total party kill. You might all die, but that horse carrying your dispatches gets through to the city, so that's fine. You sacrificed your lives to send this last message. You might win the fight, but then all of your sacks of gold fall into the river. And so it gives you you're much better able to set real stakes and have a real chance of failure, which is way more exciting and fun than the kind of, let's be honest, not very fun mainstream Pathfinder games where you know that it's been designed for you to probably be fine.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you. I think that's a good note for sure. I want to go back to what you said earlier about one of the cons of a non-lethal campaign framework being that maybe it just doesn't sound that exciting. I actually have some experience here because I think sometimes it's not even so much that it doesn't sound exciting. Sometimes it does sound exciting. Like that's something I want to do. But then you get in the middle of playing and the players just are like, want to fight things, right? Yeah. Like they kind of get in the middle of it. They're like, well, I'd rather just do this. Right. And my number one example of this in my personal gaming is when I ran a campaign of Burning Wheel. I've run lots and lots of Burning Wheel in my life. And Burning Wheel is kind of like Lord of the Rings style fantasy, but incredibly complicated modular system. But so Burning Wheel has all these life paths that are like candle maker, wood cutter, bloodletter. It's got these like little like life paths that give you skills and all that stuff. They have mechanical heft. And I wanted to do a campaign that was like craftspeople. I'm like, we're going to have a campaign where we're in the city and you're all just like woodworkers and basket weavers and shit, right? And everybody was like into the idea because like, I'd like to explore this fantasy world, but from the vantage point of a common person or from the vantage point of like a tradesman or whatever, right? Different vantage point. It was so boring. Oh my God. It was the worst. Oh, no. It was the worst series of games I've ever run. Like it was such trash. Now, granted, this is a long time ago and right when I was getting back into RPGs. And I think if I were to try something like that nowadays, I think it'd be a lot more fun. But just because my skills have improved. But it was trash. Like no one was enjoying it. And they all just wanted to go fight something. And so I feel like that could be an ever-present danger here.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you've mentioned the spectrum of like non-lethality. So like, to be honest, the going after a missing person, that's kind of a cheat. I kind of threw it in because I was trying to think of a classic adventure novel, and that was the first one that came to mind. But it's not that non-lethal. We know that's just going to be the treasure in the final boss room. But what you want is for an adventure game is you want a relatively skilled and difficult mission. I think, although not necessarily, but something that will take you into peril and is also not necessarily best served by killing everything in your way. So, for example, a science mission like in our Carapace game, investigating the termite monolith. If you just set fire to the whole thing, that doesn't fulfill your mission. So it's kind of putting these constraints on you. Similarly, making a documentary might be a good one for a modern day, or indeed just travel writing. Going on holiday, presumably with your escape route cut off, and then the one I always love, which is like the book and film Dersu Azala, which is mapping unexplored territory, because that's very old school X-crawly, and gives you a good reason to be aiming for the far side of the map and running into all kinds of random stuff.
Well, while we're kind of naming examples here of like non-lethal campaign frames, I've thought of a couple. One, I think a pilgrimage is an interesting non-lethal campaign framework. I think a funereal journey is interesting. I've actually played short campaigns like this where the whole point of it was to take the remains of a person to where they're going to be buried, right? And you see this in like a lot of other fantasy fiction, actually. I'm actually playing God of War on PS4 right now, which is amazing, by the way. And that's the whole setup. They're trying to take the ashes of the dead wife to the top of this mountain, right? And so I think now that is certainly not a non-lethal, non-combat oriented game, but it all just evolves into fights always. It doesn't matter. But I think that like a pilgrimage, a funereal journey, I've played campaigns where like it wasn't the focus of the campaign, but a feature of the campaign was traveling to different spots that were historically important to the group and reflecting on that, right? And I think what makes those examples I've just given, what I think makes those examples work is when you are able to mechanically explore it, right? And I'd like to kind of shift back over to that, because I really feel like that's the crux of this conversation is, how do you make the mechanics give you this experience, right? The question opens up entirely if you go away from D&D, in my opinion. Even a jump as small as Dungeon World gets you there, because Dungeon World, in my opinion, is a much more flexible system, because you can just create a custom move to handle whatever the cool thing is that's the focus of your campaign, right? We published a thing in Codex Hunger called The Way to Wit's End. It's excellent. It's this like 20-page Dungeon World supplement that's all about this melancholy pilgrimage, and it has all the stuff built in that you need to make Dungeon World be about a melancholy pilgrimage, right? And all the different like stations and rites that they have to go through, right? I feel like the mechanics question here is paramount. My answer is find a different game. But do you think that D&D can handle this mechanically?
I do actually, although it is also a bit of a cheat maybe, because I think a lot of OSR supplements and adventures are secretly using the D&D framework to be a different game. So actually, your mention of the pilgrimage is a great example, because when I played Ultraviolet Grasslands, our framework there was a pilgrimage to the far west. And the great tension there all the time was, should we just stop? Is it worth doing this? Should we just stop and build a new village here and leave this whole thing behind? But the thing with UVG is that, okay, sure, everyone's got, the stats in whatever game you're playing. But there's also that caravan sheet talking about your group and their travel, like what they're carrying, how many supplies they have, and so on. And that is kind of the game that you end up playing, regardless of what it says on individual, what individual stats and attributes you have. So that's, I think the mechanics can kind of be imported, or rather systems can as well, because systems aren't always mechanics, as we've discussed. So if you have structure whereby you're doing certain things, then that can function as a kind of analog or unformed system guiding you in certain ways. If, for example, you have to visit certain places in order to complete what you feel is important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that note about like OSR modules and OSR adventures kind of doing this work for you to make the D&D be about something else, that tracks. I mean, I'd say half the stuff we cover on this show does stuff like that, right? Fever Swamp is a great example. Fever Swamp is mostly just a D&D kind of thing, but it has just enough stuff about traveling through the river, about the boat, and the boat capacity and whether the boat sinks. It's got just enough like mechanical stuff layered on top of it to kind of make it its own thing. And I really feel like that's the key. Again, I keep going back to it. Like, you've got to make sure that there are rules that are doing the thing you intend for the group to be doing, because otherwise it's either going to devolve into combat, or it's going to feel shallow, right? Or it's going to feel like just a tacked on thing, right? And so I feel like that's the answer to this question we haven't really posed. But in conclusion, make some custom moves. Yeah. Well, so anything else you want to say here? I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting. I think what's interesting about this conversation is almost, is it even a conversation? Because like, I wonder like how many like party-based things are actually non-lethal assumptions to begin with, and they just evolve into combat because that's what we do, and how many are like truly non-lethal campaign frameworks. And so I think it's a fascinating question. Is there anything else you want to say about it?
No, I think let's leave that question open for the listeners to maybe provide us with their own answers. Yeah,
indeed. Let's go to the next segment. It's the companion adventures. You have some non-game media things, if you'd like to go through some of those.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, so first off, I would like to mention a book called Creatures of Near Kingdoms, which is written by ZXU and illustrated by Sharon Chin. And this was the book that inspired me to have a weird setting for my game of Carapace. It's about fictional flora and fauna that exist, or rather don't exist, in Malaysia. Each one of them is like a one-page lyrical, evocative description or short story by Zedek, and then Sharon Chin has done these linotype illustrations for them all, and it's just kind of amazing, like kind of, how to explain it, slightly dreamlike, but also naturalistic. Sometimes it feels like a hidden world, like this creature could live in where we live now, but always be slightly out of your sight. And in other cases, like the giant monument termite that builds a skyscraper tall nest in the middle of Kuala Lumpur, it's clearly from an alternate reality. and it's just really great. And you can order it directly, I think, from the author. Look for Zedek's on Twitter and maybe just DM him. That might be the way to do it. Or Google Creatures of Near Kingdoms. Really great. Not that gameable, as Zedek himself has said, but I found a way, so you never know.
I will start with all mine are like game related things, but the first one I want to say is, okay, so Jesse Ross, who we had on the special Trophy Gold episode a few episodes ago to talk about Trophy Gold, Jesse Ross and I held a contest for Core Trophy, which was an incursion writing contest, and we got like 50 entries, which was pretty amazing because they're all like in the 2,000 word range, right? So getting 50 entries is pretty great. Incursions for Trophy. One of the incursions is called A Warm and Pleasant Hum. And I'm still in the middle of judging, so I don't know the name of who wrote it. So if you wrote that incursion, I'm sorry you're not going to get to hear your name on Fear of a Black Dragon. But it's good. And I like it here as a companion adventure because it is about a colony of bees and giant bees. And I think why I love it is it's so visual, and it does a really, really great job with like the details. I think that Carapace is missing a lot of the details, a lot of the descriptive bits, right? This actually has all that descriptive stuff, like the way the insects move, the way they live, the environment, like all that stuff is just there. It's dripping on the page. And so if you needed like a sort of companion piece to Carapace to kind of give it some descriptive punch, I think A Warm and Pleasant Hum would be great. We'll have a link to those in the show notes.
Well, for films, obviously Aliens, whatever, next. But I would, for the purposes of the idea of gradually getting better at moving through a weird, fantastical maze, Labyrinth, starring David Bowie and Muppets.
Jennifer Connelly.
I'm pretty sure I've recommended this before for a different companion adventure.
I want to say Labyrinth has come up several times.
Yeah, but in this case, I would specifically look at the bit where it's that the structure of how Jennifer Connelly's character first comes into the maze, has no idea what to do with it, and then gradually figures it out. And that, I think, mirrors not the point crawl of Carapace, but both the Hex Flower and the Labyrinth move, I think, is well represented.
So I have come up with a list, a very quickly made list, if I'm being honest, just scanning my shelf, but of party-based story games with mostly non-lethal frameworks. So not just any story game, party-based story games that assume to be a sort of like non-lethal or the non-traditional kind of framework. And so my list is Our Last Best Hope by Mark Diaz Truman, which is about a group of people. I think the default setting is like in space, but I think it can be in lots of different environments. But it's a group of people who are about to face an existential calamity, and they are trying to like stop that existential calamity, whether it be a nuclear bomb going off, whether it be being, trapped in a ship that's hurtling into a black hole or whatever, right? And so it's a game that's more about like teamwork and problem solving, and so I kind of like that. Mm-hmm. I have Inspectors by Jared Sorensen, which is a party-based game about a group of Ghostbusters-style ghost hunters. It also has it has this like reality TV show aspect to it too, which is pretty great. I have Witch, The Road to Lindisfarne. In Witch, The Road to Lindisfarne, you are a group, or Lindisfarne, I can't remember how it's pronounced. You are a group of men, importantly, a group of men who are taking this woman who is accused of being a witch in the 16th century London, taking her to this holy island to burn her as a witch. I'm saying it's a non-lethal campaign framework or non-lethal framework because it's the game. There's no combat in the game. It's all about just like chatting and talking and trying to figure out if the witch actually did it. And indeed, you may not burn her at the end. So I like that one. I've got Mouse Guard, not really a story game, but I think it works. Mouse Guard, probably don't have to explain what Mouse Guard is to folks, but basically anthropomorphic. They are mice that mice that are ranger mice defending the land that they live in. And what I think is great about Mouse Guard is many of the encounters and things that you do in Mouse Guard are not necessarily fighting off monstrosities, which in this world is like just bigger animals. It's actually more of a problem-solving thing. It's more about guiding, grain peddlers safely down a path. It's about fording rivers. It's about helping supplies reach the various communities. And so I kind of like that I think it's kind of what I wanted to do with my Burning Wheel campaign that didn't quite work. I think Mouse Guard's a better execution of that. Dogs in the Vineyard by Vincent Baker is a sort of fantasy 19th century Mormons, and that can be lethal, but mostly what the dogs are doing is just religious work, proselytizing and tending to the flock. Ghost Lines by John Harbour, which is just another sort of it's a steamwork or steampunk kind of ghost hunting thing. A very, 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 very oddball choice here. We are here to see the evil wizard Cormacor. Do you know that one, Tom?
No, is it Icelandic or something from the name? I mean, what
I think Matthias Holter had something to do with it, so it's kind of in the same neighborhood. But no, it's by Jason Morningstar, actually. And it's about a group of like traditional, like kind of like fantasy party characters who have arrived where they intend to arrive, which is the Tower of the Wizard Cormacor, but he's not there. And the whole game is about like, well, Cormacor is not here, so what are we doing now, right? And I kind of like it. It's amusing. Those are my choices. That was a lot, but I wanted to kind of throw this out there. And then we had the same last thing here. Goblin's Henchman has a blog where they talk about hex flowers, among many other things. Tom, any other thoughts there?
Yeah, so, well, I should say the URL, goblinshenchman.wordpress.com, and this is probably the best place to go to start trying to understand hex flowers, because it has quite a few different examples of how they work, and you can sort of see Goblin's Henchman's thought processes noodling through various posts about it. And there are also, quite a few useful OSRE D&D-ish adventure resources, some of which, such as the spreadsheet mapping technique posts, continue to baffle me, even more than the hex flowers, but, it's important work, and I'm glad somebody's doing it who isn't me.
Indeed. Yeah, when I was going through it, I was just really delighted by all the examples of these hex flower maps, some of which came from the Gauntlet forums, incidentally. I didn't even know these conversations were happening on the Gauntlet forums, but there you go. And I still don't think I 100% understand it, but I may want to try it in the future. Yeah. So I'm intrigued. Listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com. The aforementioned forums are forums.gauntlet-rpg.com. Patreon, if you would love to support this show, giving us some dollars on Patreon is a great idea. Patreon.com/gauntlet. And, gosh, I think that's all I've got. Tom, anything else?
No, I think that's it. So,
well, Tom, I don't know why I asked you that. Just thank you so much. This has been great. My brain is addled by hex flowers. I can't help it.
I know. Thanks also to our awesome editor, Luke Quaid. And thank you for listening. And good night.
Buckets of peppered horse urine.